Hello, welcome. I'm really glad to be here. I'm very glad that you can all be here too. You're going to have to excuse me a little bit because I'm going to be a little bit rusty this morning. It's very apposite because, as Paul suggested, we're talking about resilience today, and well, that's going to be an underlying theme. Well, I've had to draw on all my depths of resilience because I didn't get in till after 2 o'clock last night, having been on the train stuck from London due to rail problems, 2.5 hours late, taxi home from Leeds, deeply. But still really made up because I went to the British Museum and saw the final days of a fantastic exhibition about the Ice Age art and its connections with the modern mind. It's a real shame. If you haven't seen it, get the book. It is astounding stuff. I'm going to use a watery analogy. Here's my little aid memoir of a little river. I'm going to bring a number of little tributaries of stories together that all kind of have a resonance around resilience. Some personal, some about this river where I live. If I could throw a stone from that bank over that wall, it would probably land in my garden. I live 50 metres away from this river in Keighley, which is the River Worth. It runs down from Haworth Moor through the urban centre of Keighley and is a significant tributary of the River Aire. It's an absolute lovely river, and like most urban rivers, it's suffered for many years with heavy industrial pollution, but now is a beautiful river that acts as a green corridor. There's a huge amount of diversity of wildlife there. Often when I walk along there taking the dog, just noticed the wicket has gone. I've got a lurcher, so it's nice to have a fellow around. I often see herons, pied wagtails, dippers, kingfishers, and there's a lovely stock of brown trout and grayling, and as a fly fisher, it's a great joy to just be able to wander a few metres from my door to cast a fly and catch some of the most amazing fish I've ever caught. Not necessarily big fish, but just amazingly beautiful wild brown trout and grayling. This is looking upstream, past Dalton Mill, heading up into Keighley. Heading downstream, I'm going to take you on a little journey on this river. As I say, it was a river that suffered terribly, and it's surprising just how much advocacy I do for this river when I'm stood midstream with my fly rod. Sometimes in the act of taking a trout, as people shout and, "Oh, what are you doing in there, fella? You won't catch anything in there, nothing but prams and car wheels and litter." And there was one evening back in April, the first time that we'd actually had any significant fly life coming off, very late in the season, and this community patrol officer came down, and he wasn't asking what I was doing there. He was like, "You'll never catch anything in there, man." And I was like, I've literally just let a wild trout go. I was saying, "No, this is an absolutely beautiful river. There's grayling, there's brown trout." Pointed out a kingfisher that had just flashed by. There was a dipper on this little boulder midstream. And people were just blind to it. I've never... It's interesting the perception that people have of a river, and most people will just walk by and say, "That's a dead river." They'll see the litter, they'll see the rubbish, they'll see the industrial estates on the other side, and they just assume that this river is a dirty, polluted thing with no life and, perhaps more importantly, no value. and therefore it doesn't even enter into their idea or sensibilities, but actually there's something going on, and maybe something that's a bit special that's going on, but it's literally right under their noses. Like most urban rivers, as well as suffering the pollution, but in the last sort of, I'm assuming, decade or maybe 15 or even 20 years, probably through just neglect, it has cleaned up since that pollution has gone. And the wildlife, as wildlife seems to do, in its very resilient way, re-inhabited this neglected stretch of river. And perhaps because it's been neglected and no one thinks about it and no one uses it, maybe that's been to its benefit. The rocks that you see at the bottom here, that's the fish pass that was put in by Yorkshire Water in 2008. They did that in partnership with the Highways Agency and the Environment Agency after they did a electro-fishing study that showed this healthy population of wild brown trout and grayling. And it does seem to work. I have seen fish make their way up and past this weir. Unfortunately, again, weirs are one of the big barriers to fish. And although this has been a significant improvement, there's a very high weir about 500 metres further up, and then some small ones as well, which all act as impediments to the trout and their ability to go further up and spawn. And this is a beauty that I caught out of that weir pool. It's an absolutely beautiful fish. I never expected a fish as gorgeous as that. For those of you who are fly fishers, and even those who fish with a tenkara style, boo! Oh dear. I don't know what you're missing. I was able to cast my fly into the top of that flow just there. You try doing that with your free weight, and allow the fly to disappear into this plunge pool. It took, I don't know how deep that plunge pool is, but it took about 11 foot of line. I had the rod tip down Paul, pretty much all the way into the water, and then this fly tugged and jigged, and on the end of it was this amazing fish. Just a stunning fish, and a real privilege to get a quick photo on the side and then release it. It was absolutely beautiful, and it's those little moments that are really important. This is looking up at that weir. All of these large boulders here are the original ones that got washed down in that very first spate. But actually it now creates perhaps one of the most fantastic fishing spots I've ever had the opportunity to fish, because you've got lots of grassy islands, all of these boulder areas, and again, if you fish tenkara, it's just an absolute heaven of a stretch of water. There's the bypass. You come through into a beautiful pool. This is where the grayling inhabit, and you get a lot of kingfishers flitting up all the way under the bridge, and dippers as well. It's a gorgeous spot. There's a little footpath that runs by. And then maybe 100 metres beyond this point, we end up running into the River Aire, and that's the end of the Worth. But for me, this is my river, this is where I live, and part of my sensibility and my sense of place is about feeling embedded and connected to a place. I think that's really important. and I hope some of these other stories I'm going to talk about. It's important to a lot of other people, but perhaps not people who we would necessarily consider perhaps in our work. So I will often have conversations, and really pleasant conversations, with 2 or 3 homeless gentlemen who sleep under the bypass under here. My girlfriend Helen, who used to be a harm reduction worker, she isn't anymore, but we have conversations with a couple of substance misusers as well, and they all gravitate to this river in a funny sort of way. And in some sense, this river becomes something more than just a place for me to catch fish. It's also a place where I notice that people come for time out, for consolation, for respite as well. I go there for a bit of all 3 of those, and some activity when I go fly fishing. But sense of place is really important, and that's very indicative of that exhibition I was talking about that I saw yesterday. That sense of place came across so strongly in the artwork. It was some of it was 40,000 years old, and just unbelievable. Growing up, I think you could say I'm an outdoors child, and perhaps even more so. Unfortunately, my mum had to endure this with regular resignation, was that I'm a watery child as well. So any body of water that I found myself near, be it a stream, a river, a lake or the sea, it wouldn't take long before I was fully immersed in that world, whether I came dressed for it or not. That's been my whole upbringing, has been pretty much the outdoors. I grew up in an age in the 70s when kids could pretty much roam free for most of the day in their small little groups or gangs, and light bonfires and cook sausages over those bonfires, and go fishing and climb walls and climb trees and climb rocks, and no one thought much about it, provided you didn't get up to too much mischief. I also was a member of a very active scout group that was really keen to get outdoors and learn some really good skills. And for me, I've had this sensibility where I don't know where it comes from. Both my parents are South Londoners, although I grew up in Yorkshire. I have a strong connection to London. But the outdoors has meant a lot for me. And again, I will return to those elements of consolation and solace and respite as well that the outdoors can bring. After school, after A-levels, I gave up my dreams of becoming the next Donald McCullin, a famous photojournalist, and on a whim, with a friend of mine, gave up a photography and journalism degree at Nottingham Trent University to go and travel the world instead. We set off with $5 a day as our budget to travel around the United States, Canada, Mexico, Australia, and end up wherever we wanted. We landed in Atlanta, Georgia, and we set off hitchhiking, sleeping under freeway bridges, in the desert, in the bushes, and had so many adventures, it's hard to know. 2 real encounters on, I think they're encounters that are really important, and important to this sense of place, are we climbed into the Sierra Nevada mountains, and we got up to about 12,500 feet high up in the Sierras, and one night we had a very close encounter with bears. 5 black bears came to visit our encampment, and although our food was stashed away in a tree, as was recommended by the rangers, those black bears found a way to get hold of that food, and we spent the night listening to those bears, enjoying a very happy bear picnic. But the following morning, as I opened the tent and looked at the devastation that had been wrought, perhaps through our own ignorance, I don't know, but humans in the bear world, maybe we were ones who were not in the right there. But there was a mum and 2 cubs, probably no further away than Paul is now from me. So an extremely close encounter as I peered out of the tent. Being a rather young, dumb 18-year-old from Leeds, who had a penchant for photography, I turned around, grabbed my camera, jumped out the tent, and obviously Mum wasn't too keen on this, so she stood up, all 7 foot of her, and gave me a look that I can just only tell you is etched itself on my brain and perhaps more importantly in my heart ever since. It was a look, I've never had a look like that, and I used to go out and clubbing in Leeds and have encounters with doormen, but I'll tell you that Mama Bear, she had a look that you would not want to encounter. So very gently and carefully edged backwards, and when we got to a half-decent distance where she felt comfortable, she relaxed, and my friend Simon and I had maybe 10 minutes of being able to slowly track and trace this mum and her 2 cubs as she disappeared into the woods. It was just a stunning moment, and I had so many encounters like that as I travelled round. Simon ended up splitting up with me, not through any acrimonious fallout, but simply that he fell in love with the archetypal California girl and thought that sleeping in a soft bed was way better than sleeping under freeway bridges and railroad yards and things like that. So I ended up travelling by myself up into Canada, down into Mexico, and it was at that point that I began to have encounters where I began to meet and live with indigenous people and begin to have a whole different style of education that I could never have imagined, and a greater sense of place embedded in my sensibility through staying with various peoples from the northwest of the United States, the Tlingit, the Coquito, people who you don't necessarily hear of, down into Mexico, the Quichol Indians, the California Indians that you never really hear of as well. And I learned something that, again, has been an important part and is an important part of the presentation, which is a sense of place and this sense of I live here. Now that little statement means so much more. It's not necessarily a first person statement. So when I see a dipper fly up this river, I recognise that statement in that flash of flight of I live here. I share this space with you, and I share this space with the trout and the grayling and the kingfishers and the mayfly, and this informs why this river is so important to me and why I do what I do. I phone up the EA when I think there's a pollution, or suspected pollution. I've gone to some risk to pull out 50-litre drum, paint thinner drums with a third of the contents still in there from the weir after spades. I go balsam bashing, and along this part here we get a whole lot of balsam. I've got the plant tracker, I report the knotweed, and I'm a little army of one, because apart from a few other anglers, but they don't really care, no one else really sees the value in this little river. And yet I talk about it with everyone, and everyone's kind of like eyes open as I go, now this is a beautiful river. And right now I'm in perhaps a stage of simply advocating for this space as a body of one. But the more I do so, the more I see those people again, and this time they've come down with the kids, and they're spending more time, and they'll remember who I am, and they'll talk about, and they'll go, what else is going on? And so I can talk about some mayfly that might be hatching there as well. I think it's just being there is perhaps one of the most important things for me. And by being there, I can engage and talk with people. This slide is another aspect of resilience, and also a little journey that I've been going on as well. It's an Oriental or Chinese painting, and it encapsulates a lot of elements there. It also encapsulates this very strong sensibility of I live here, or sense of place. Because unlike a lot of Western art, often when we look at landscapes, the figures in Chinese art are often very small and diminutive. And the reason why is that they often think of themselves as embedded within that landscape and a part of that landscape, which is often a very different sensibility from how we can approach it. The reason why that's important to me is that I've been on a 27-year journey as well within the martial arts, and started perhaps classically where a lot of people started, by doing judo and jiu-jitsu and karate and aikido. But as I was encouraged by my teachers every time they picked me off the floor, having put me there 10,000 times or more, they were always wanting me to engage deeper in something more. But the reason why I'm on the floor and they're not is not down to my physical ability or technique, although that's where you start off thinking. It's more to do with how you think and feel and relate to people. And it was by beginning to immerse myself in reading about those cultures, of where these arts came from, and the spirit or the soul of what underlies that began to deepen those encounters that I'd had on my travels. Again, it was about a sense of place. And these pictures demonstrate something as well, which is this concept of a Tao, or this sense of flow, this sense of connection, this sense of things that are always moving, always dynamic, always emergent. And that's very much an analogy that rivers become associated with. And another reason why the river is so important as a place for people to go to, for people to find respite, to find solace. And it was during that time when I was practicing the martial arts, but I also became engaged in 18 years in a career of child protection work and children's therapy with sexually abused children and grossly neglected and physically abused children. I'd gone back to university after my travels, and I don't know why, for whatever reason, I ended up getting and moving towards psychology and particularly therapeutic work with children, and ended up vicariously, after a number of part-time posts, working in a new therapeutic unit in Leeds, with some of the most damaged children that I'd ever encountered. And for the best part of that career, I had clinical supervision with one of the leading doctors, child psychiatrists, and we talked about resilience all the time. Resilience was a key factor in how these children managed, a little bit like a dirty river. It wasn't something that people really wanted to get their hands stuck into. Most people rejected these kids. We had the devil's own job in keeping these kids in school, keeping these kids engaged in activities, keeping these kids actually just on track and having a halfway decent life. We had a therapeutic approach which was very much about, these are just kids, and whatever history comes with them, that's the secondary element. It was quite a new and radical way of looking at that at that time, but the dividends paid in the long run. It was during that supervision that I had with my doctor that, as I say, resilience came up a lot. We talked about post-traumatic stress a lot. And little did I know that that was going to be a significant element in my life when, at the beginning of 7 days of leave, while riding a motorbike to Whitby, I got hit by a very large lorry. And flattened, quite literally. This is just the lower half. I thought I'd give purple pants today because I know maybe some of you might have had a rough night and you don't want to see what's under that. Yeah, as I say, that's just the lower half of the knee. Unfortunately, yeah, the truck left a large tyre track up my body as it exited over my shoulder, and my life of activity, of climbing, mountain biking, of fishing, of trail running, of work, of going out clubbing, came to an end literally in a matter of seconds. And although I wasn't expected to live, I did live, much to the surprise of everyone. And although I wasn't expected to walk, I did walk. And although I wasn't expected to actually return to work, I did return to work. And although I wasn't expected to be able to run again, I did run again. And Dr. Jill Tagg, my clinical supervisor, would come to visit me in hospital. I ended up living in hospital for quite a long time. It was about 2.5 years of rehab and recovery. She came up to me and she had this conversation with me, which at the time, in my drug adult state, didn't really make much sense. She goes, "You know, Phil, we've talked about resilience all these years," and she says, "Now you're going to find out what that really means." And she says, "No matter how much work I've done and how much work you've done in terms of research and the essays and the papers," says, "you're going to know something that I will never know, which is what it's really like to have to dig yourself out from the bottom and build yourself up." It's a little bit like my little urban river, the River Worth, that at one point was completely dead and completely off the radar for a lot of people, and very like the children who I looked after, completely neglected, completely off the radar. And yet, for all the trouble that we created, and by God they'd created so much trouble, we were super, super resilient. And most of them have gone on to university. Most of them are now fantastic young adults doing fantastic things, and yet they were completely at the margins of life, completely beyond hope. But hope is a really important metaphor, and again, for me, rivers carry that as well as climbing. When I had all that metalwork inside my leg, it was impossible really for me to walk for any length of time without being in a great deal of pain. However, I found that I could climb all day, and so provided people could get me to the base of the cliff, I was perfectly happy. So I ended up becoming quite an accomplished climber. This is me. Sorry, sleepyhead. That's me there. This is 3 pitches up in the south of France. Each pitch is about 60 metres. I'm at the top of the 3rd pitch with maybe just another 20 metres to go. So you work that out in feet, it's quite a long way. And I've got to edge along this slab to then go up there and straight down. It's these knife edge fins of limestone in Provence, and you just basically can drive up, which suited me, and get out and rig up, and off you go climbing. It's an astounding place. Some people don't think that's me, even though there is a guy with a prosthetic limb there, but just so you know, that's me at Kilnsey Crag in the Yorkshire Dales, which is a big overhanging cliff that's pretty famous for climbing. That's me having a rest and a bit of a smile. Unfortunately, you don't get a sense of how high up I am there, but there you go. So for me, I threw myself into outdoor activities, even though it wasn't expected for me to do so. Why? How? Because I wanted to find out what I could do. And it's about that. It's about what you can do with what you've got at the time. And that's the analogy that I have for you guys, which is, although you may feel that perhaps what you do has little impression, it can have big effects later on in life. It was only in 2010 that I actually had my final operation, which was to remove the metalwork from this femur, which then put me back to square one again. So I was back in the wheelchair and back to learning to walk again, and found out that I could run. And I ended up being one of the very first people to get a wee blade and take these blades trail running. No one had done that before, and the reason why, my mum would say I was bloody minded, but for me it was about being out on the land and being in a space that made sense to me, and not so much testing what I could do, but just about being out there. And fishing was another adjunct to that, as well as the climbing, as well as the mountain biking. And to that end, 10 years after that accident, I had the crazy notion of running the Dales Way, 80 miles or so, over 3 days to raise money for various charities. And unfortunately I had to bring that run to an end after the 2nd day, just because of the amount of pain I was in from all the sites of injury. But that didn't matter, because as I did that journey, just like being mid-flow in a river that was neglected by so many people, I met so many people. It was just like, what are you doing here? You're not meant to be trail running with a blade. That's not possible. You can't do that. And I was like, well, it's not about trying to prove something. It's about just trying to find out what you can do. And I think that's something that I've found as I've learned more and more about urban trout schemes, is that you guys are perhaps doing something that many people would find a little crazy. And why would you bother? You know, these rivers, they're not really significant, are they? You know, we haven't had to bring them into our consciousness for a long time, and why are they important? How do you justify these questions to people who think you're a little bit crazy and a little bit on the fringe? Why is it important? Is it important? Does it matter? I think it matters, but does it matter to you, or does it matter to them? And is it important that it matters to them? I'm not sure. I'm not here to give you that answer. For me, it kind of gets encapsulated by Worse with Hope by Samuel Beckett, which is, if you don't try and do something, then who's going to do it? Who's going to do that thing that makes a difference? Why did I go to the trouble of pulling out 50-gallon paint thinner cans from a weir why do I bother? Because the following day something else comes down the river, and the following day after that something comes down the river. Why do I bother plant tracking? Why do I bother reporting incidents to the Environment Agency? But it's about a sense of place. It's where I live. I'm hoping that you guys feel connected to where you live. I'm hoping that you guys feel something that I do, which is that where I live and how I relate to it is important, whether you've been brought up in the city or whether you've been brought up in the outdoors. But if you don't try, who's going to try on your behalf? I think that's part of the engagement. It's part of what resilience is about, is just trying. And even if it's just doing one thing, then do it. There was a time in hospital when the only thing that I could move was this left hand. And that was all I could do for a few months. And then slowly but surely I restored movement to the whole of my body, to the point where I can now wade and cast a fly when I hadn't cast a fly for over a decade, and go climbing and become engaged in a little urban river that I live next to. Why? Because it's there. Why? Because it's beautiful as well. And that's something that I've found out that resonated at the British Museum. Was there was no violence there, it was all beauty. I don't know if you can get that. It was just astounding to see the embeddedness that these people had with their environment, and just how much it mattered to their everyday lives, and it was reflected in that artwork. It was absolutely stunning, that sense of place that they had. And I hope that's why you do what you do and why you love doing what you do. I'm going to end up there because I've kind of waffled when I shouldn't have waffled, but I hope I've kind of hit the point a little bit. But I'm just a bloke who's had a bit of a journey and loves an urban river and kind of does his best for that urban river in the way that he does. And I'm not saying I'm particularly good at that, but I do what I do. Thank you very much.